Welcome to Harriet Tubman, Chapter 4. I'm going to be reading Chapter 4 tonight and kind of sharing some strategies with you of what I do as I read, and hopefully that will help you on your reading quizzes. You'll hear me say it in my videos. The very first strategy is where you read. So be sure you're picking a place in your house where you can be focused, where you can spend some time in quiet, away from any family members that could be distracting you, like little siblings. Um, turn off the TV, turn off the music, and just kind of zone in on the chapter. My second strategy for you would be to take notes. This is especially important if you're reading like over the weekend or reading a couple days before. Let's say, you know, it's due on Wednesday and you have a basketball game on Tuesday, so you know you want to read on Monday night, but you need to remember it for Wednesday. So if you jot down some notes, you can just refresh yourself on Wednesday morning and kind of figure out what the chapter was about and remember all those details that you might need for the quiz. So I'm in my room, I'm in my comfy reading chair, everyone else in my house is asleep, and I'm ready to go. So this chapter is chapter 4, so I'm going to write that down first. Chapter 4, so I don't lose it in my notes, and this one is called Hired Out. So I always want to zone in because authors name chapters for reasons, right? So if this chapter is named Hired Out, someone must be getting hired out, or someone is hired out, or something's hired out. So I'm going to come back to this at the end and remember what on earth was it talking about. But this is probably one of the main points of the chapter. So, chapter 4, Hired Out. In the summer of 1826, Harriet was 6 years old, and by plantation standards, big enough to work. Wow, I'm going to stop there because that's a big deal. So she was 6 years old when she started working. That's like kindergarten. Yikes. She carried water to the field hands and listened to their rhythmical singing, watched how the movement of their hands, their bodies, was paced to the rhythm of the song. She was old enough to have a sense of family. She enjoyed being with her father and her mother, her brothers and sisters. There were 10 children now, either living in the cabin because they worked on the master's plantation, or else living so near it that they could visit Ben and old Rip. So she's got 10 total children. That's crazy. Okay, so 10 children belonging to children of old Ben and Rip. I sometimes like to draw little pictures instead of words. That just kind of helps trigger my memory later. That year, in the fall, a woman drove up to the big house in a wagon. She went inside and stayed for quite a while. Almost as soon as she arrived, word of what she wanted was relayed through the quarter. This woman had come to see the master. I'm going to stop there and I'm just going to make sure I think I got everything on the page. She's 6 years old, 10 children, and now there's this mystery woman. She wanted to hire one of the master's slaves, preferably a girl and young because she couldn't pay very much. The woman said that any of the little ones running around the cabins would do. The house slave who brought this whispered news to the quarter that the woman wasn't quality. She was barely a cut above poor white folks when compared to the master. She was a weaver and the wife of a man named James Cook, a man who hunted and trapped for a living. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to notice the new characters. Whenever new characters are introduced, that usually points us to something. So we have James Cook and his wife. She's a weaver. So that must mean like weaving some type of like cloth, my prediction would be. And he is a hunter and trapper. And it seems like they don't have a lot of money because they're here for a kid and they're saying she's not of quality. Before 6-year-old Harriet knew what was happening, she was seated in the wagon beside this strange white woman who was now her mistress. She had been hired out by the master, Edward Brodus. Okay, so here's where the chapter comes in, right? Hired out. Who's hired out? Harriet. Mrs. James Cook was going to pay him a small sum a month for the services of Harriet. Harriet sat in the wagon, frightened, listened to the clip-clop of the horses' feet. They kept going further and farther away from the quarter on the plantation where she had been born and brought up. They went through the woods, along an old road called a rolling road, though she did not know it. These roads were made in the days when tobacco was the chief crop on the eastern shore, and hogsheads of tobacco were rolled down to the wharves and the boat landings and the roads, thus made still bear the name rolling road. Okay, that's a new term for me. Again, new terms point to something, especially like these ones are in quotes, right? It's kind of like insurrection in chapter 1. Is it insurrection? No, it was the word that meant they earned their freedom after the death. Anyway, that word was in italics, right? So this word is in quotations. So I'm going to put rolling road. And what was rolled down it? The tobacco. And you'll see me make some spelling mistakes. Remember, these are just your notes. It's okay to be a little off in spelling. This is just for you. When the wagon finally stopped near a house, Harriet was disappointed in it. It was not like the big house. Remember, the big house is on Master Broda's farm. It was built of logs, just like the cabin in the quarters. But at least it was near a river, though she never knew the name of the river. Once she got inside, she found it had more than one room and it had an upstairs. She had never before been inside a house where people had a separate room in which they slept, for she had never been in the big house. There was no reason why she should. Even old Rit didn't go there unless she was sent for. Okay, so this is a new setting as well. So I'm just going to draw like a little picture of like a log home. You guys know how good I am at drawing. There's my house. And it's by a river. She noted that, so I'm gonna note that as well. Mrs. Cook was a weaver. She spent most of the day in front of a big loom, head bent, arms moving back and forth. Harriet was supposed to help her. She stood for hours winding yarn, her hands clumsy, unaccustomed to the job she had to do, the thread catching on the rough places on her fingers. The air was filled with fuzz and lint, so she kept sneezing and dropping the yarn. I'm going to stop there because this is like her job, right? So her first job is, it looks like she's supposed to help her wind yarn. Okay, but it doesn't seem like she was very good at it, right? She's clumsy. She's sneezing because of everything in the air. I'm not really sure we're being successful here. It seemed to Harriet that the clatter of the loom and the whir and the thump of the spinning wheel went on day and night too. It confused her. She longed to be back in the quarter in the cabin with Ben and Rit. She was afraid. She was lonesome. She hated the inside of the house. She slept in the kitchen in a corner near the fireplace. Toward morning, when the fire went out, she slept with her feet in and under the warm ashes because it was so cold at night. These people fed her scraps of food, much as they might have fed a dog. So I'm going to stop there. That seems like another important part. So how was she treated here? She slept on floor. She was cold, right? She's literally sticking her feet in ashes. So one other strategy that I like to use when I'm reading is to picture what the text is saying. So it's telling you that the warm ashes, she would stick her feet in them. So think of a fire burnt out, but the ashes are still warm. So her feet would be like under that dirt ash just to stay warm. Because remember, she's only 6, right? Like that's like a sad image. And that would be memorable, right? Like when I walk away from this chapter, I'm going to remember her feet in those ashes. And she was only fed scraps of food. All right. I think I got all of the main ideas in that section, so I'm going to keep going. The woman said Harriet was clumsy, slow, no help at all. So the man set her to watching his trap lines. He had set his trap sets for muskrats. So I don't really know what a muskrat is, so I'm going to look that up. And I already had it ready for you. A muskrat looks like this sucker right here. It's like a rodent, a rat. Yuck. Okay, so I'm going to note that down. So this was her first job. She wasn't very good at it. So her second job was watching trap lines for muskrats. Although I don't think I'm going to be forgetting that muskrat anytime soon. That image is going to be like burned in my head. It was cold by the river, but Harriet didn't mind. It was quiet there. She was away from the clatter of the loom. She could breathe without getting her mouth and nose full of lint. As she walked the length of Cook's trap line, she saw an occasional gunning skiff, heard the wild, free crying of the water birds, watched them fly up, wings spread wide. She learned to stand still on the bank of the river, and thus she saw the muskrats swimming, noses above water, watched them dive. She discovered the burrows they made in the bank, built with mud and bits of straw. By careful watching, she was able to distinguish the dark brown fur of a muskrat near the burrow, though they were the same color as the mud along the bank. Okay, so she doesn't seem bad at this job, right? She's just watching the river, out by the river. It might be cold, but she doesn't seem to hate this like outside task. So I think we're on the right track here. One morning she woke up coughing, eyes watering, feeling sick, hot, utterly miserable. Mrs. Cook said that the slaves were always pretending to be sick in order to avoid work. That young as Minty was, she too had learned to slack off on her work. They seemed to be born knowing how to do this. Well, that doesn't seem very kind. Mrs. Cook does not think very well of her. So James Cook sent Minty out to inspect his trap lines. Okay, so she is sick and now going to inspect the lines. I'm going to make a prediction that that's probably not going to go well. She stumbled along, head down, vision blurred by the watering of her eyes. She wasn't crying, but her eyes kept filling up with tears. The water in the river was so cold that she shuddered as she waded along the edge. She had to wade to see if the traps had been sprung. So she has to go in the water to figure that out. She bent over, shivering, examining a trap, not liking the scaly look of the tails of the muskrat, and yet not liking to see them caught in the traps. They wouldn't swim anymore, wouldn't dive anymore after they were caught. They had an unpleasant musky smell, but she still didn't like to see them held fast in the traps. That's kind of like a cute characteristic of her. Like she doesn't even like to see the animals harmed. Okay, so I'm going to say pros. She's outside. Negatives. Animals hurt. And it's cold. And now she's sick. Right? None of these are positives. When she went back to the house, a small bent over figure, shivering and shaking, it was obvious that she was really sick. Mrs. Cook got a blanket and threw it over her, wondering audibly what was wrong with Minty. I know what was wrong with Minty. She's sick. She was so sick that old Rit heard about it and went to Edward Broda's and asked him to take Minty away from Cook's to let her come home where Rit could look after her. The master consented. He was fond of old Rit, and he did not want to lose Harriet if he could help it. Okay, so that's kind of nice. So the word spread that she was sick and got back to her mom, and so her mom asked the master if she could come home, and he said yes. That's like a positive for Master Broda, right? He's not like this terrible man. We do see instances, right? He promised them freedom, and now he's saying, like, yeah, she's sick, she can come home. Of course, he's like selfish in that, like, he doesn't want to lose her because she makes profit, but still, that's kind. Sometimes there in the quarter, when they nursed themselves, they got well. They all seemed to have an inexplicable knowledge of the curative power of roots and herbs that grew in the woods and the meadows. Rit nursed Harriet back to health. Okay, so this is kind of like the next part. She was sick. She was sent back to Rit to get well. Okay. She had the measles. Okay, so she wasn't just sick, right? She had the measles. And it named this illness, so I'm going to take note of that because that could be important, right? It wasn't just a cold, it wasn't the flu, it was the measles. It's calling it the measles. Because of the wading the cold water of the river, she developed bronchitis. So measles and bronchitis. Rit kept giving her a hot and bitter brew made from the root of a plant that Ben brought back from the woods. There was always a huskiness in Harriet's voice after that. It stayed there the rest of her life, an undertone that made her singing voice memorable. It lent an added timbre to her speaking voice. Huh. So I've never read that before. So she has like a husky voice forever. Husky voice. As soon as Harriet recovered, was one was once more playing with the young children, running and laughing, singing and listening to the stories told by the old folks, the master sent her back to the house of James Cook. Okay, so she gets better. She has to go back to her job. Rick grumbled about it, first to herself and then to Ben when he came home from the woods. Minty's back at Cook's, she said. That's how I would picture saying it. He nodded, neither approving nor disapproving. She thought, he already knows it. Probably word got to him in the woods. They're poor folks, she said. Not much better than white trash. Can't afford to own any slaves. Can't even afford to hire full-grown ones, so they take Minty. He said calmly, well, at least, Rit went on, her voice raised, they get her for almost nothing. About all she cost 'em is for her food, and there ain't much of that from the looks of her when she came back to the quarter. Nothing but skin drawn over bones, no meat on her at all. Which we know, I mean, she was eating like scraps like a dog, so old Rit ain't false here. Ben said, maybe she'll learn to be a weaver. Maybe she won't, Rit answered sharply, as though he were arguing with her. That's another thing. Quality don't work at nothing like that. The wives don't work and they don't give the orders. Shows what kind of folks the cooks are. She gives the orders. She works at the weaving. Weaves other folks' cloth for them. Okay, I'm going to go back for a second because it didn't make sense when I read it in my head. And when something doesn't make sense, I want to go backwards to make sure I understand it. That's another thing. Quality don't work at nothing like that. The wives don't work and they don't give the orders. Okay, so I think what she's saying is if she was like a real proper woman, wife, she wouldn't be working, she wouldn't give the orders. But the cook, she says, shows what kind of folks the cooks are. She gives the orders. So she's saying, like, Miss Cook is the one in this house who gives the orders. Miss Cook is doing the weaving. She's working here. Like, she's even working for other people. She's weaving other people's cloth. So, like, that's not proper, not like it shows that you didn't have money. Then she stopped talking and sighed, thinking. Of course, if Minty did learn to weave, it would be good. She'd never know the bite of an overseer's whip, never know what it felt like to hold a hoe in rough, work-hardened hands, never give off the choking stink of the field hands. So this goes back to what we learned in chapter 1. Like the worst job was to be a field hand. So if Minty learns to be a weaver, that would be a good choice for her future. She said hopefully, maybe she'll learn to be a weaver. Ben nodded. Perhaps, he said cautiously. If not a weaver, something else. She's smarter than all the rest put together. When Minta, or Minty, whose Christian name was Harriet, went back to the cook's, she soon learned that she was to stay indoors and learn to weave. She was not to walk cook's trap lines anymore. Okay, I'm going to stop that because we're near the end of the page, so I want to summarize this. Everything here is about like what is Harriet going to do? Hopefully she'll learn to be a weaver. Okay, so she was sent back to Rit to get well, back to Cook's, maybe to weave. I mean, she's going to have to weave, but is she going to be a weaver? I don't know. She felt like the muskrats. One moment she had seen them diving and swimming in the river, and then suddenly, click, and they were caught fast in the trap. She remembered that some of them had fought to free themselves, tearing fur and flesh to get free. She decided that she simply would not learn to weave. She would not. She hated being inside the house with the loom and the spinning wheel and the endless hanks of yarn. There was always lint in the air. She was always cold. She did not get enough to eat. She wanted to go home where she could be outdoors. Okay, so there was, if you noticed here, there's an exclamation point, and there's not a ton of these if you look in the text. Like, yes, when you hear the click, right, that like onomatopoeia sound, but she would not, right? So that draws my attention here. So she is not going to learn to weave. And then I'm going to put, nope. She does not want to. She ain't gonna learn to weave. That's what she thinks. The woman that she called her mistress was always cross. She kept telling her that she was stupid, stupid, stupid. So, like, her parents were calling her smarter than everyone put together. The mistress here is calling her stupid. Is she stupid? Because it doesn't seem like it's me. It just seems like she doesn't want to do it, so she's not going to do it. And she's only 6. So that kind of fits with a 6-year-old, right? And so finally, Cook's wife sent Harriet back to the Brodas plantation. She said that she was unteachable, intractable, hopelessly stupid. Okay, so let's see. Cook's wife saying stupid. But I'm going to draw it back to an arrow. She doesn't want to. She's not stupid. And now we are to our italic section, which I said that there is one of these at the end of each section, and it's kind of a separate entity from the story, but it adds to what's going on either during the time of the story or a little bit later or even more in the future to who Harriet's admirers are. And I said there's always going to be a test question here. So I am going to put italics. So when I'm looking back in my notes, I know that like there is going to be a question from here. It says early in the 19th century, the dream of freedom had begun spreading through the slave cabins on all the plantations. Almost every night, somewhere in the South, a slave slipped away from the quarter. They hid in swamps, they walked incredible distances. Some of them reached the North and freedom. Others were caught and brought back to cabins, or brought back in chains. There were few plantations that could boast that they had never had a slave run away. Okay, so none of that's new information to me, so I'm not going to write anything down, right? They ran away, some got away, some didn't get away. People are trying to run away. By 1826, there were so many fugitives living in Canada that plantation owners in Maryland and Kentucky persuaded Henry Clay, then Secretary of State, to ask the Canadian government to work out a plan whereby these fugitives worth thousands of dollars could be lawfully returned to their owners. Okay, so Henry Clay is Secretary of State, and it looks like he's going to reach out to Canada and say, send back slaves, please. The Americans waited eagerly for an answer. It was a long time coming, and when it finally arrived, it was most unsatisfactory. The Canadian government stated that the request of the American Secretary of State had been received, and that was all. There was no suggestion made as to how American slave owners could obtain the slaves who had taken refuge in Canada. So it's like, yep, got your message, bro. That's it. Received. So I'm gonna write message received. And I'm gonna put that in quotes and act like that's what the Canadian said. Canadians. There we go. All right, so that's the end of my chapter. I'm gonna stop right here. I'm going to go ahead and review my notes. So I'm going to pull them up this direction. Go back up to that. So I've got about 1 page of notes, almost exactly. And I'm just going to review them from top to bottom and make sure like I just finished the chapter. So while it's still fresh in my mind, I would just want to like go over it quickly. All right, so chapter 4, hired out. We now know that means that Harriet was hired out. So she was, and I'm going to go through this with my thing. She was 6 years old when she started working. There's now a whole bunch of children. Sorry, I froze for a second. There's now a whole bunch of children, 10 of them to Ben and Rit. And then James Cook and his wife came to town. Doesn't seem like they had any money. He was a hunter-trapper. She was a weaver. And now Harriet was taken to this log cabin next to a river, right? So they passed that rolling road, and I know that it got its name from rolling based on all the tobacco that was rolled down it. And then we got her first job was to wind yarn. She wasn't very good at that. But the people didn't treat her very well. She slept on the floor. She was always cold. Remember those poor feet in the ashes? She ate scraps of food. Her second job was to watch for trap lines of those muskrats, which she liked because it was outside, but she didn't really like to see them trapped. And then she got sick kind of from the cold. She was so sick that she got sent back to Old Rit. We know she had the measles and bronchitis, and that's left a permanently husky kind of voice, which she was known for. She went back to the cooks. Her mom was hoping she'd become a weaver, but whoa, did she not want to, right? So even though Miss Cook thought she was stupid, we don't really think she was stupid. She just didn't want to do that. And then the italics, we have Henry Clay, who was the Secretary of State, sent a letter to Canada, and he's saying like, hey, can you send back our slaves? And they're like, hey, we heard you. Okay, so what I just did there is a retelling of the story. So you should be able to, when you get to the end of the chapter, if someone was like, hey, what was that chapter about? You should be able to review the main points here, which is like at 6 years old, Harriet went to work for James Cook and his wife. You know, her first job was winding yarn and she wasn't great at it. They treated her super poorly and she didn't like weave for a while because she stunk at that. So then she went and did the trap job for James Cook, but then she got the measles. When she recovered from the measles, she had this husky voice and she had to keep working, but she still didn't do a good job on it. So the cook sent her back like, she's unteachable. You can't like do anything with her. I mean, she's stupid. When in reality, we know that Harriet just didn't want to do the task at hand. And Canada is not helping out the Americans, or at least the American slave owners, right? So that's called a retelling of the chapter. At the end of the chapter, you need to sit back, and if you can't retell it, then maybe you need to reread it. So if you can't retell the story, chances are halfway through, maybe your mind was wondering to like what you were going to have for dinner or, you know, are my friends on FaceTime and can I join them right now, right? If your mind starts to wander to other things, then you're not focused on the chapter at hand. And remember, we're reading for an academic purpose. So when we're reading for academics, it's different from reading for fun. If I'm reading for fun, if I miss one paragraph, it might not really make a difference towards my comprehension of the whole book. Here, if I miss one paragraph, I might have missed her entire first job, or I might have missed the fact that she had measles, right? So at the end, make sure you can look back and really like know that you've understood all of the main points of the chapter. So I would take these notes, and if I'm reading the night before, like let's say this is Tuesday night and I know my quiz is tomorrow morning, I would take these notes and I would just keep them on me tomorrow. And in the morning, sometime between 8:45 and 9:20 when we start, you know, our morning meeting, I would go ahead and just reread these notes one more time and make sure I understand these key points, right? I don't need to memorize these, but the more I read them, the more those things are going to stick in my mind. Most of the questions are multiple choice, so I know like these are the things I'm going to be looking for. So I hope that was helpful. I have chapter 5 coming at you guys as well for Friday's quiz. Um, and I hope that you start to learn to use these strategies that I'm modeling for you, um, and really are able to implement them as well.